A lot of the training that we pilots go through is done to enable us to act almost automatically when faced with, for example, handling difficulties. But what happens when those automatic reactions becomes the very thing that's causing the problems in the first place? Stay tuned. The pilots who were going to operate Republic Airways flight 4439 woke up around 9:30 in the morning on November the 6th, 2019. They were staying at a hotel in Detroit after having flown 3 sectors on the previous day, and they were now getting ready to operate the second and last day together on their current roster. The first flight was scheduled at a comfortable 1500 hours local time, which had allowed the crew to have a nice long sleep in, and they reported feeling rested and in good spirit as they took the shuttle bus towards the airport. It was a beautiful day with light winds and almost clear skies, perfect for flying in other words. The captain was 32 years old and had been working with the airline for just over 4 years. He had 4,500 hours of total time, and 3,135 of those were flown on the Embraer 170 family. He was assisted by a 30-year-old first officer who had started with Republic just over a year before the flight. This meant that he was quite new, around 2,300 hours of total time and 677 on the type. The pilots had gotten along well during that previous day, which was the very first time that they had flown together, and on that day the first officer had been pilot flying for 2 out of the 3 legs, which meant that on the second day it was the captain's turn to start and to fly 2 legs. We pilots always try to do an equal amount of pilot flying and pilot monitoring flights in order to get a similar amount of landing and takeoff recency, and also just to keep the work as varied as possible. The only times that we might step away from that principle is if there are operational reasons for it, like bad weather, training or airport limitations, for example. Now, the aircraft that the crew were going to operate was a 12-year-old Embraer ERJ 170. It is a lovely regional jet with a place for 70 passengers, sporting undermounted engines and a trimmable horizontal stabilizer, which is going to play a big role in this story. Because this particular aircraft had suffered from a long history of issues with its trim system. During the month before the flight, the trim switch on the captain's control yoke had several times stopped working, causing an ACAS warning to the pilots. Every time that had happened, it had been replaced, only for the same warning message to appear a few days or weeks later. These type of intermittent faults can be really annoying for the engineers who have to work with them, because the way that they work is by following a very specific set of instructions depending on what kind of failure that they're facing. And once they have done the work, well, then they will test the system, and if the system says that the fault has been cleared, well, then the aircraft will be released until that same fault manifests itself again. But on the day of this flight, there were no problems reported and the technical logbook was completely clean. So what was actually going on here? What kind of gremlins were actually present in the trim system causing these intermittent faults? Well, to explain that, we will first need to look into what the pitch trim system actually is and how it works. You see, the pitch trim system is an absolutely crucial component in flying modern aircraft because it enables us to operate in a wide variety of different speeds and weights. The aircraft is primarily controlled around the pitch axis with the use of its elevators. These are little rudders at the back of the horizontal stabilizer, which, when moved, changes the amount of downforce created by the horizontal stabilizer and therefore pitches the aircraft up or down. The problem, though, is that the amount of elevator deflection needed to get the aircraft to pitch changes with different speeds, as well as with the weight and balance of the aircraft. And also, keeping a constant pull or push on the yoke for a long time as the aircraft is climbing or descending is really tiresome for the pilots. And this is where the trimmable horizontal stabilizer comes in. Because once the pilots or the autopilot have used the elevators to achieve the pitch that they want, well, then they can use the trim system to move the entire back wing, the horizontal stabilizer, into a new angle that can maintain this new pitch. This means that the forces on the yoke are reduced until there is no inputs needed at all, and that's what we, the pilots, refer to as the aircraft being in trim. During initial pilot training, a lot of effort is put on teaching pilots to always trim the aircraft out, as it becomes much easier to handle and to operate if this is done properly. Every time that the aircraft changes speed, pitch or center of gravity, the aircraft needs to be trimmed out. And on the Boeing 737 you can easily see this happening by those big trim wheels turning, both when the pilots and when the autopilot is flying the aircraft. On the Embraer there are no trim wheels, but instead a movable trim scale showing the angle of the stabilizer. Now, one thing that is really important to remember is that the trimmable stabilizer is very powerful because of its size, so it must be kept under strict control throughout the flight. A runaway stabilizer, which is when the stabilizer starts moving by itself, can be very dangerous, as the force needed to override it will quickly become very large. On the Embraer 170, the stabilizer can be controlled in 4 different ways. Either by a split trim switch next to the captain's left thumb on his yoke or on the first officer's corresponding yoke, or by a couple of standby switches on the center control panel, or finally by the autopilot. The reason that the switches are split in 2 is to make sure that the movement of the switch is deliberate by the crew and not caused by, for example, a short circuit in the cable to the switch. If one part of the split switches would indicate a trim input but not the other for more than 5 seconds, a pitch trim switch fail message would appear to the pilots on the ACAS display, and that switch would be disregarded and disengaged for a short period of time. This computer monitors all of the inputs, and it will cut off any input that lasts longer than 3 seconds continuously. These are some of the safety features that are put in place in order to avoid a trim runaway from happening. But if for whatever reason it would still happen, there are also emergency procedures in force for the pilots to follow, including memory items. Now, memory items are actions that the pilots need to commit to memory, and actions straight away in case a particular serious failure happens that is time critical. In the case of a trim runaway, Republic Airways had only one memory item, which was to push the red trim quick disconnect switch on either yoke. That would then stop the movement of the electric motor moving the horizontal stabilizer. After having done the memory items, the crew is then supposed to use the quick reference card. It's a little card containing further actions to be taken, followed by the quick reference handbook for the full failure checklist. We pilots train how to recognize and handle a trim runaway every few years in the simulator, and provided it is caught early, it's generally not a big issue. So that's how the system works and some of the safety features, but it doesn't really explain what was going on with this particular aircraft. Why did the captain's trim switch keep malfunctioning no matter how much the engineers tried to replace components and troubleshoot it? Well, what no one had noticed was that the wiring bundles coming from the trim switch and going down to the trim computer were mounted close to the forward fastening bolt of the captain's yoke. That bolt had been locked into position using a metal wire which had been twisted around itself into a pigtail, but it hadn't been tucked away properly. Instead, the pigtail had started rubbing up against the wire bundle and slowly eating away at the insulation, leading to the wire being exposed and causing occasional short circuits. But of course, the pilots operating on this day knew nothing about this, as they were getting ready for their flights. Around 1400 local time, the pilots started their pre-flight preparation in Detroit Metro Wayne County Airport. All the documentation looked really good and nothing really sticking out, so they proceeded to brief their cabin crew and then walked out to the aircraft. Like I mentioned before, the captain would start as pilot flying for the first leg over towards New York, LaGuardia Airport. Then the first officer would take over and fly it to Atlanta, and then finally the captain would bring it back to their home base in LaGuardia again. They started boarding their passengers, and around 1500 they departed towards New York. The takeoff and initial climb were completely normal, with the captain hand flying the aircraft during the first couple of thousand feet, just like he normally did. During that first part of any flight, the aircraft will need to go through several pitch changes. It will change from a relatively steep pitch up during the takeoff phase into a lower pitch to accelerate in order for the flaps to be retracted, and then the pitch will be modulated in order to get the speeds needed for the following climb phases. Since the captain was hand flying this segment, he would have constantly needed to be trimming using his trim switch on the yoke, but this is not something that he likely would have thought about. It's just something that he would have done naturally because he would have been so used to it from years of flying. And this is basically similar to what you do when you're out cycling and you need to make a turn. Like, you don't need to think about what you're doing. That's how it feels for us when we're trimming the aircraft. After the aircraft had established itself in cruise and on autopilot, a warning message suddenly appeared on the ACAS display. The message read, "Pitch trim switch 1 fail," again indicating that the captain's trim switch was not working properly. The aircraft was flying fine on autopilot, and the pilots discussed this indication and went through the associated checklist, which really didn't say much other than that the warning was advisory. They saw no reason to switch controls for this failure. Instead, they started preparing for the approach into LaGuardia without thinking much more of it. They initiated the descent, and the captain executed a completely normal approach and landing, during which the trim system worked perfectly fine. When they pulled up at the gate, the captain contacted their maintenance department, telling them about the ACAS warning, and he also entered the failure into the aircraft's technical logbook. This was the start of the sequence that would ultimately lead up to this very serious incident that this video is all about. But before I can tell you about the details, here comes a short message from my sponsors who, together with my awesome Patreons, makes it possible for me and my team to make these videos. Do you like great food but you don't trust yourself in the kitchen, or simply you're like me and you don't have time to plan for every single meal and buy all of the ingredients? Well, if that's the case, you have to check out today's sponsor, HelloFresh, a meal kit delivery service with step-by-step recipe cards and fresh, high-quality ingredients. HelloFresh is a great fit for my family because it makes mealtime so much simpler and stress-free. There's no more, what food should we make tonight nonsense. My son Lucas has actually been making all of the meals this past week because he thinks it's really fun to follow their precise recipes. He says, and I quote here, "It's like building Lego, but you can eat it afterwards." HelloFresh offers a wide variety of recipes every single week and options in different markets, so your dinners will always be different. You can select their weekly recipes or modify the servings, schedule delivery at your convenience, and choose among, for example, calorie smart, vegetarian or family-friendly recipes. And obviously, you can pause or cancel your subscription at any time. If you want to start your healthy eating journey today, then click on the link here below and use my code HelloPilot to get 65% off if you're in the United States, but the code is valid worldwide, so wherever you are, you'll get some kind of special discount. And guys, check it out, it is really great. Thank you HelloFresh, now back to the video. The engineers quickly arrived to the aircraft and started working on the faulty switch. The pilots were told that the spare switch that was needed was about 20 minutes away in a storage facility, and while the pilots were waiting, the engineers partly removed the old switch. At some point though, whilst the engineers were working, the company must have decided that it was not worth delaying the subsequent 2 flights because of this issue. The aircraft could fly perfectly fine using the backup switches or the first officer system, so instead of finishing the work, the engineers were told to remount the switch, and then they needed to complete what's called a HEAL release. Now, HEAL stands for Hold Item List, and it means that certain non-critical maintenance items can be put onto a list to be fixed later on. Every aircraft manufacturer can decide what items can be safely added to the HEAL list and how long the aircraft can continue to fly with these failures before it needs to be fixed. When a system is put on the HEAL list and before the aircraft is allowed to depart, an in-op sticker, like this one, which you can find on my merch store, must be placed on the inoperative system to remind the crew not to use it. But the problem with doing that on the trim switch is that it's on the yoke, and there really isn't a good way to attach it there, so the in-op sticker was never fitted. There was also no way to deactivate that single switch completely, but since it had been working fine on the way in, it wasn't seen as really a big deal. The pilots were then briefed on the actions that had been taken, and the captain verified that the technical logbook had been properly filled in. No one did a functional test of the switch after it had been remounted because it wasn't supposed to be used anyway. After this, the engineers left the aircraft and the cabin crew started boarding the outbound passengers who were going to Atlanta. The first officer was going to be pilot flying for the following leg, and the aircraft soon pushed back and started their second flight of the day. This flight went off without any kind of problems, and the warning message didn't reappear during that flight. The crew did a standard turnaround in Atlanta, and for the last flight of the day, the captain was once again going to be pilot flying. There were very few passengers booked on this last flight, only 6 of them, so that meant that on the incident flight there was only 9 people on board. 6 passengers, 2 pilots and 1 cabin crew. The takeoff performance was calculated and the pilots decided to do a standard flap 2 departure. And at around 20:50 local time, the aircraft pushed back from the gate and started its engines. The latest weather in Atlanta was very nice, with only some light easterly winds, 15 degrees Celsius outside and only thin, very high clouds. The aircraft taxied out, and at time 21:05 the captain advanced the thrust levels and began the takeoff roll on runway 09 left. After takeoff, the aircraft started climbing at a quite high rate, almost 4,000 feet per minute, which wasn't unusual given the very low passenger weight that they were carrying. The captain was again hand-flying the aircraft, and at around 1,500 feet he started pitching the aircraft forward to accelerate in order to start retracting the flaps. He asked the first officer for flaps 1 as the nose started to come down and the speed started increasing. Because of the low weight, the aircraft was climbing with a quite high pitch angle, so he needed to pitch forward quite a bit in order to reduce that. This also meant that he needed to apply some trim, which he did using the trim switches on his yoke, which he had done thousands of times before. Now, that trim switch was not supposed to be used, but he likely completely forgot that, because years of training and force of habit is a really powerful thing. And also, remember that there was no in-op sticker there to remind him. The aircraft now started trimming, but instead of the forces on the yoke getting lesser and lesser, the complete opposite started happening. The controls just kept getting heavier and heavier, and he now needed to push forward using more and more force in order to reduce the climb rate. Now, the natural way for a pilot to react in this case is to continue trying to trim away the forces, but the more he did so, the worse the situation became. The captain looked down on the trim indicator and realized to his horror that it was indeed moving, but not in the way that he wanted to be. The trim was moving more and more into the nose up position. As this was going on, the first officer initially didn't notice anything. This is one of the issues with the stabilizer trim problem. It needs to be very clearly communicated by the pilot who notices it, because there are no visual or oral warnings of it occurring when the autopilot is not engaged. The captain now did call the first officer to engage the autopilot, but when he tried to do that, it immediately disengaged due to the forces being applied to the captain's yoke. The first officer left the autopilot switch for a while and got ready to switch over to the new air traffic control frequency when the captain suddenly called out, we have a problem. Can you call in an emergency to air traffic control? The first officer, quite understandably, responded, what? Why? What kind of emergency should I call? And the captain said that, I think that we have a runaway stabilizer. At time 21:06 and 53 seconds, the first emergency call was transmitted to Atlanta Tower. The tower responded, asked about the nature of the emergency, and offered any assistance that they could provide. When an emergency is called, the aircraft in the emergency will receive absolute priority, and that's exactly what now happened. Atlanta Tower offered the aircraft to turn right for an immediate downwind for an approach into runway 10 or into any runway that they might need, but unfortunately things were not going to be quite that simple. Because in the cockpit, the trim situation was now getting more and more extreme, with the horizontal stabilizer pitching the aircraft up, eventually reaching the maximum 13 degrees nose-up position. At this point, the captain needed to use all of his force to keep the nose from rising higher and higher. He called flaps and then moved the flaps himself into the up position to see if that would resolve the situation, but it didn't help. He then asked the first officer to help him to try and get the nose down, and both pilots now started pushing forward with all of their strength, but the nose just kept rising, and as it did, the speed of the aircraft was quickly reducing. Since the captain had identified the failure as a runaway stabilizer, he now started to execute the memory items, which basically included that he pushed the quick trim disconnect switch on his yoke. He also asked the first officer to try to do the same thing. This stopped the trimming as soon as he pushed the switch, but he likely then left the button a couple of times to try and reverse the up trim with his trim switch, and every time that he did that, the situation just kept getting worse. Both pilots were now using their knees to try and push the nose down, and the captain remembered that he could possibly get the nose down if he put the aircraft into a bank, so that's what he did. The highest pitch recorded during this event was 27 degrees pitch up, and the speed had at that point dropped to 138 knots, very close to the aircraft's stall speed. They now entered into a 45-degree bank turn to the right, which is pretty steep. It's actually the kind of angle that we use to practice steep turns in the sim with. This roll angle enabled the nose to come down slightly, which decreased the climb rate, but it didn't completely fix the problem as the aircraft kept climbing. The captain had the quick reference card in his lap, but he needed both hands in order to keep the aircraft under control, which meant that he couldn't start reading it. But he did remember the previous failure that they had during the first flight, and this led him to believe that it was likely the left side, that was once again causing the trim issue. So he called the first officer to please push the trim cutout switch for the number 1 system on the center pedestal. The problem though was that the trim system was designed to continue to work using all systems if only one of the 2 cutout switches were pressed. The only way to make sure that the electric motor driving the stabilizer was not activated was to push both cutout buttons, but they didn't do that. As the pilots were executing these steep turns, still pushing madly forward and trying to troubleshoot the issue, air traffic control was trying to call them to get updates on what was happening and also to give them vectors for the landing. Several of those calls went unanswered because the pilots were just too focused on flying the aircraft to be able to answer them. But at time 21:08 and 15 seconds, the first officer finally did manage to call air traffic control, basically telling them that they were in a stalling situation. And after that, there were several calls between the tower and the aircraft, and you could just see from the transcripts how much stress the pilots was under during this time. After almost 2 full 360-degree turns, at time 21:10 and 40 seconds, the captain handed over the controls to the first officer. The aircraft was then still turning and climbing through around 10,000 feet, and the emergency had lasted for around 5 minutes at that point. When the first officer got control, he immediately started trying to trim the aircraft forward using his own trim switch. And luckily, it started working, and the forces on the yoke finally started easing off. The aircraft reached its highest altitude of 14,830 feet before the first officer had it fully under control. He then continued a wide right-hand turn and started following the vectors that Atlanta Tower was giving them in order to get back towards runway 10. The captain now looked through the quick reference card, but instead of completing the checklist, they both decided that they had the aircraft under control now and they didn't need to troubleshoot it any further. Now, here it's worth noting that even if the initial actions might have solved the immediate issue, the emergency checklist often contain a lot of good information and considerations, so running through the applicable part of the checklist is always a good idea to do if the time permits. During the vectors, the captain momentarily tried the backup trim switch and it seemed to be working fine, so at time 21:14 and 30 seconds he decided to take back control again from the first officer. It only took a few seconds after he took over before the flight data recorder again started registering several trim up commands coming from the captain's yoke, and he needed once again to start pushing forward in order to control the pitch. This time, however, the pilots reacted quicker and the captain transferred the controls back to the first officer, who could trim the aircraft out. It's unclear why the captain decided to take the controls back at that point, because the first officer clearly had no problems handling the aircraft, but now, there were no mentions about any interactions with the cabin crew and the passengers from the pilots as this was happening, but I imagine that once they had the aircraft under control and they had decided what to do, they must have talked to them, because there's no question that the passengers on this flight would have noticed that something was seriously wrong, and they would have likely been quite distressed. But what was actually going on here? Why did the aircraft's trim start to run away as soon as the captain took over manual controls, but not when the first officer was flying? Well, later examinations of the wiring from the trim switch revealed the damages that I explained to you earlier, but while those damages were the cause for the initial failure messages that the crew had received, they were not the reason for the trim problems that they were now experiencing. No, further examinations of the captain's trim switch showed some unusual indent marks on one side of the switch housing. These marks could only have appeared if the switch had been installed upside down. This meant that it was likely that during the ground stop before the flight, when the engineers had been working on the switch, they had removed it and then quickly reattached it again, but without noticing it, mounting it the wrong way. And since the switch was not deactivated, when the captain started flying the aircraft, his old flying habits kicked in and he started trimming the aircraft using the trim switch. With every trim command that he then gave, the trim would have moved in the wrong way, causing more manual forces to be needed, not less. This caused him to continue to trim to try to get rid of those forces, not noticing the correlation between his own input and the worsening trim situation. The trim system was actually doing precisely what it was told to do, it just didn't match what the captain was expecting from it. This is an almost perfect example of how hard it can be to work against learned muscle memory habits. Now, it might look like it should be quite easy to figure out by us sitting here in a chair watching it, but I can assure you that during the heat of the moment, it is not easy. Once the crew started thinking that the aircraft had a trim runaway, which is a conclusion that the captain drew quite early, it would have been really hard to get out of that mental model. Realizing that the trim was reversed would not have been an obvious conclusion to reach, especially since the switch worked perfectly earlier during the day. Now, it was great to see how they worked together, kept communicating and finally swapped controls, which is what ultimately got them out of this situation. And then to see how ATC provided excellent help throughout this ordeal. At one point, ATC apparently even went out onto the ground frequency asking if there was any pilots on there that had experience of trim issues on the Embraer 170 and if they could maybe help the emergency crew. One Delta pilot with experience flying the type did come onto the tower frequency and tried helping out by reminding the crew of the memory items, but at that point the aircraft was already under control. Now, I love to see this kind of thinking outside of the box and constructive creativity on behalf of air traffic control. It is great to see. Anyway, the first officer now continued to follow the radar vectors that they were given and descended back towards the airport. He configured the aircraft normally, and since he was now flying, they had no further issues with the trim system. At time 02:25 and 55 seconds, the aircraft landed safely back on runway 10 in Atlanta and then taxied into the gate. The aircraft was then taken out of service and brought in for an extensive troubleshooting. No failures were initially found until those small indents were noticed on the trim switch housing and the reason for the emergency became apparent. It turned out that Embraer had actually issued a service bulletin back in February of 2015 advising operators of the possibility that the trim switch could be installed inverted. A special support was recommended to be fitted in order to fix the issue, and the service bulletin needed to be complied with within 7,500 hours of operation or 36 months, whichever came first. But unfortunately, that had not been done on the incident aircraft. As a result of this investigation, the NTSB recommended Embraer to improve the fitting of the trim system wire bundles to avoid this kind of damage that had occurred on the accident aircraft. They also needed to add new inspections to find these type of issues before they could become a problem, and also both the FAA and the Brazilian authorities needed to enforce these new rules and to make the new fitting of the aircraft trim switch mandatory so it could never be fitted inverted again. The investigation also found that even though the captain knew he shouldn't use the trim switch, it would have been very hard to avoid the deep-rooted habits that he had formed, and that's what led to the incident developing. Because of this, discussions were also held of whether or not it was really a good idea to allow dispatch with a faulty, still activated trim switch. Now, if you like this video, I hope I have earned a subscription from you, and check out this video next, which I think that you're going to find really fascinating, or watch all of my accident videos in this playlist. If you want to support the work that I do, then please consider joining my Patreon crew, send a super thanks, or get yourself some awesome merch. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.